What the hell happened to Johnny Hendricks? A knockout artist with a left hand that flatlined the unflatlinable. The man who pushed GSP to his absolute limit, and many will say beat him. Then suddenly, he couldn't even make weight anymore. This is the bizarre story of Bigg Rigg's rise and fall. Johnny grew up in Oklahoma, which, if you know anything about wrestling, is like growing up with football in Texas. Johnny was a two-time NCAA Division I champion and a four-time All-American. In America, when you're that good at wrestling, you've got a couple of paths ahead of you. You either try to make the Olympic team, you go into coaching, or you get punched in the face for money. Luckily for us, and unlucky for his opponents, Johnny chose the latter. Johnny made his MMA debut in 2008. And look, like a lot of wrestlers that were transitioning to MMA, his early fights weren't exactly works of art. It was more about grinding dudes down and winning by decision. But then something changed. He found that left hand. And when he did, it was like watching a whole new fighter emerge. We have seen this time and time again. Think of Justin Gaethje, Chuck Liddell, and Dan Henderson, all accomplished wrestlers becoming knockout artists. But what makes Hendricks different is that his power drew parallels to Ngannou and Rumble Johnson. Many even considered him to be the pound-for-pound hardest hitter in the UFC, and with some devastating knockouts that he's had, he left very little argument against that. Even Joe Rogan said this.
Dude, you might be the single biggest power puncher in the sport of MMA, and that's no joke, man.
His first big test came in the UFC when he fought Amir Sadallah in 2009. Sadallah was no slouch. He had a decent striking and a solid ground game. But none of that mattered when Johnny landed that left hook from hell. Bigg Rigg had just won his first fight in the UFC in just 29 seconds. After the Sadallah fight, he kept stacking up wins, but things really started getting spicy when he faced John Fitch in 2011. Now, if you've been following MMA for a while, you know that Fitch was a beast back then. He wasn't flashy, but the dude knew how to grind out wins like no one else. Imagine Bilal Muhammad at his grindiest. That is who John Fitch was in his prime. Admittedly a boring fighter, but racking up wins like nobody's business. This was the guy who had only lost to GSP in the UFC, and everyone thought he was going to use his grinding style to control Johnny. But what happened was the complete opposite. 12 seconds. That's all it took for Hendricks to flatline Fitch with a perfectly timed left hand. I've never been hit like that before. I didn't even see it coming. It was like a truck hit me, Fitch would then later say about the knockout. And if you are an old school MMA fan, you know just how insane that moment was. Fitch was practically untouchable before that fight. Seeing him get starched that quickly by Hendricks was like watching the impossible happen right in front of your eyes. And that is when people really started to take notice. We weren't just looking at a wrestler with power anymore. We were looking at a potential title contender. And it wasn't just the Fitch fight. It was what came after. 2 fights later, Hendricks squared off against Martin Kampmann, another dangerous striker. And guess what? Same story, different chapter. Johnny landed a missile of a left hand in just 46 seconds and Kampmann went down like a sack of bricks. Johnny's left hand was gaining mythical status. He was building momentum like a freight train at this point. It felt like every fight was another step towards something bigger. He became a fan favorite for his aggressive style, his willingness to stand and bang, and of course, that ridiculous power. He became a wrestler who figured out he had dynamite in his hands and just couldn't stop blowing people up. The thing about momentum in MMA is it either takes you straight to the top or it puts a giant target on your back. And for Johnny, it was doing both. With each knockout, Hendricks wasn't just winning fights. He was building a case for something bigger. And in the welterweight division, bigger meant one thing: a shot at Georges St-Pierre. By late 2012, Johnny had become the guy in the welterweight division, the boogeyman that everyone at welterweight was trying to avoid. His meteoric rise to the top only meant one thing: a fight against the reigning welterweight champion at the time and the greatest welterweight fighter in MMA history, Georges St-Pierre. By the time Hendricks was set to face George, GSP had already cemented his legacy as one of the GOATs, not just of his division, but of the sport as a whole. He had defended his title 9 times against some of the best fighters in the world. He was known for being insanely technical with god-tier wrestling, precision striking, and cardio for days. But, and this is important, GSP had also been looking a little, well, beatable. He was still winning, but his fights were starting to feel more tactical than dominant. This is what gave fans a glimmer of hope that Johnny might be able to unseat the long-ruling king of the division. All of this created a very interesting dynamic leading up to UFC 167. You had GSP, the reigning champ, who everyone thought might be slowing down, versus Johnny Hendricks, the hungry challenger with a kill switch in his left hand. And to make things even better, Johnny wasn't shy about calling his shot. He told anyone who would listen that he was going to knock GSP out, take the belt, and become the new king of the welterweight division. But of course, it wouldn't be that simple, because, well, GSP is GSP, and what followed was one of the most controversial fights in UFC history. And that's no hyperbole either. Even still to this day, if you ask someone what's the most controversial fight of all time, chances are GSP versus Hendricks makes that list. But what happened in the fight that made it so controversial? You see, right from the start, it was clear that this wasn't going to be another easy night for GSP. Johnny came out swinging, literally, and landed some heavy shots early on. GSP tried to use his jab and keep the distance, but Johnny wasn't having any of it. He closed the gap, stuffed some takedowns, and kept finding a home for that left hand. By the second round, GSP's face was already starting to look like it had been through a meat grinder. But GSP, being GSP, didn't just roll over. He kept fighting, using his footwork and landing jabs whenever he could. Still, as the fight went on, it was hard not to notice that Johnny was landing the harder, cleaner shots. And by the time the final bell rang, most of us watching thought Johnny had done enough to win. Even GSP himself admitted at the post-fight press conference, "He hits like a truck. He hurt me a lot. I'm not the same person now that I was before the fight." But then came the judge's decision, and that is where all of the controversy starts. GSP got the nod by split decision, and the MMA world lost its collective mind. Dana White was furious, fans were divided, and Johnny, well, of course, he thought he got robbed. The word robbery gets thrown around a lot in the MMA community, but this time even Dana White joined the chorus, calling the decision atrocious. When the boss man himself criticizes the judge's call, you know it's not just the fans venting. The wrong person walked out with the title that day. What made the entire situation even messier is that GSP didn't stick around for an inevitable rematch. Instead, he announced he was stepping away from the sport, leaving the welterweight division in limbo, and Johnny without the closure that he deserved.
That decision that happens, right? You don't just say, hey, I'm going to take a while off, and maybe I'll be back, maybe I won't. You owe it to the fans, you owe it to that belt, you owe it to this company, and you owe it to Johnny Hendricks to give him that opportunity to fight again, unless you're going to retire. I'm a fight promoter, and we run a business, and he's the biggest fighter in the sport. But it's not fair. It's not right. It's not the way things work.
70% of my power was enough.
It wasn't enough because you left it in the hands of the judges. It wasn't enough. You better do 100% next time.
Yes. Thank you, Dana. Ouch.
With GSP gone, the division needed a new king. For many, Hendricks was already wearing an invisible crown after the GSP fight. Now, he just needed to make it official. After GSP retired, the UFC needed a new champion. Of course, Hendricks would be the first in line to challenge for the title, with many fans calling him the uncrowned champ after his controversial loss to GSP. He faced Robbie Lawler at UFC 171 for the vacant welterweight title. Now, if you're a fan of violent, no-nonsense brawls, this was your fight. Lawler, who had just come back to the UFC after some time away, had been looking better than ever. He was tough, he was powerful, and he was hungry as a lion. But Johnny was just as hungry, if not more. And these two went to war. From the opening bell, it was clear this wasn't going to be a chess match. This was going to be a fight. And man, did they deliver. Johnny and Robbie just stood there in the pocket, trading bombs like it was a street fight. Every time Johnny landed that left hand, you could almost hear the crowd holding its breath. But Lawler ate every punch and kept coming back with his own heavy shots, showing that championship heart of his. The fight ended up going the distance, but it wasn't one of those fights where you could say, oh, he clearly won. After the war, Lawler gave credit to Hendricks' resilience. He's a grinder, he took a lot of shots and kept coming forward. He's a tough guy who fought hard for 5 rounds. It was tight, every round was close, but in the end, Bigg Rigg got the win by unanimous decision. The fight was so close that the UFC decided to run it back immediately. If you thought the first fight was a brawl, just wait until you see this one. Round after round, these two guys kept beating the living daylights out of each other. Hendricks had moments where he looked like he was going to pull it off, and it seemed like the judges might finally see things his way. But once again, Robbie Lawler showed his durability, and in the later rounds, he outworked Hendricks to get a decision victory. And just like that, Johnny Hendricks' championship reign ended before it could even properly start. Here is where the story starts to take a real turn, because after the crushing title fight loss, Johnny Hendricks' career started to spiral in a way that almost no one saw coming. Now, we all know the physical toll that fighting takes on a guy, but for Johnny, the fall was absolutely insane. Johnny faced a critical problem that contributed to his downfall: weight cutting. In his earlier fights, Johnny was able to make the 170-pound limit with relative ease. But over time, things started to get tricky. And by tricky, I mean downright dangerous. You can see it in the footage. Hendricks was looking more and more like he was fighting the scale, just as much as he was fighting his opponents. At first, it was just some small struggles here and there. But as time went on, it was clear that Johnny was having major issues making weight. Johnny's weight issues reached their peak in 2016 at UFC 200. He was supposed to face Kelvin Gastelum, but Hendricks missed weight again. That was a huge blow to his reputation. Fans were mad, the UFC brass was mad, and even Hendricks was clearly frustrated with himself. The guy who had once arguably beaten the greatest of all time was now in a position where even making weight seemed like an impossible task. At this point, Johnny had already moved up to middleweight. He was trying to find a new weight class to fight at, and in 2017, he faced Tim Boetsch at UFC Fight Night. This was supposed to be his fresh start, but the reality was, it wasn't. Hendricks looked slower, less explosive, and more out of shape than ever. Boetsch picked him apart, and Hendricks lost once again.
Has it been frustrating, or do you see a clear path back to the top?
No, I don't see a clear path, and that was half my problem. Is I always thought that I earned my spot, and now I don't care if it's earned or not. I'm not worried about. I'm taking it one fight at a time. If I get back there, that's cool, which I think I will. Right? It's going to be a long, hard road. I have a feeling it's going to be like me in 70.
He fought his last fight in the UFC in 2017 against Paulo Costa, and the fight was basically an assault, as Joe Rogan puts it.
The fight was basically an assault. It was an assault. You would never believe that Johnny Hendricks was a former world champion if you saw the way the Eraser beat the shit out of him. I mean, he just beat the shit out of him. Johnny fired back. I mean, he's tough. He tried, threw some leg kicks, threw some punches, but he was just getting fucking destroyed.
But there was another factor in Johnny's decline that cannot be ignored: Usada. The UFC's anti-doping program had kicked off in 2015, and the timing of Johnny's decline raised some questions. Rumors of PED use followed Johnny like a shadow, and honestly, they didn't come out of nowhere. At his peak, Johnny was a monster, shredded, explosive, and delivering knockouts with that infamous left hand. But when Usada entered the game, things changed, fast. His once ripped physique softened, his power seemed to fade, and his performances started going downhill.
Did you think Hendricks was on something?
It's like all mind games. Oh, you're on steroids. Oh, you're on this. I want to talk about a doping thing. Really? You know what I mean?
The only thing I can say is I didn't want to attack one particular individual, and I wanted to change the system, because if you attack one individual, another one will come.
Right.
So in that particular case, it was Hendricks.
Some even say he was flat out scared of testing. Just check out the footage of his reaction when questioned about drug testing before his fight with GSP. It's all over the internet, and fans still talk about it.
Why won't you do it now?
Yeah. Why won't I do it? Because he's on VADA.
But why not? VADA was proven from a lot of guys in the UFC and in boxing world.
State Commission of Nevada said don't do VADA.
And you trust more an SEC with all the
heck yeah. Hey, are you gonna trust your trust your opponent? Or would you rather trust?
Personally, I trust VADA because they've done it a long time. So.
Hey, you're Canadian, that's why.
To be clear, Hendricks never tested positive and always denied using PEDs. But the speculation stuck like glue. For many, the dramatic drop-off in his career left one big question. Was Johnny's dominance all natural, or was there more to the story? It's easy to get caught up in the drama, the missed weight, the failed title defenses, the dramatic downfall, and the steroid allegation. But when you really think about it, Johnny's career is full of what could have been moments. Yeah, he's not the champion everyone thought he'd be, but make no mistake, Johnny Hendricks made his mark on the sport in ways that are still being talked about today. The fight everyone remembers Hendricks for is the one against GSP. Whether you think he won or lost that fight, there is no denying that Johnny Hendricks was the toughest test that Georges St-Pierre ever faced. If you ask anyone in the MMA world, they'll tell you, Hendricks came closer than anyone to dethroning the legend. That's a bigger achievement than any, given the legends that GSP had faced in his career. Even George said after the fight,
without a doubt, my toughest fight. And
let's not forget, Georges St-Pierre retired after that fight. Coincidence? You decide. A lot of people believe GSP didn't just retire because of burnout. He retired because he knew he had been in the fight of his life against Johnny Hendricks.
Much better I could have fought him. I knew that he was going to be a challenge. And my first time facing him, I beat him. They ripped my heart out, It sucks, but go home, get better. I don't really know how much better I can get. I knew I won the belt. I just didn't impress those three. And gosh dang it, that sucks.